The horse drew the last of its breath in a long, weary sigh. The dust it kicked up settling slow in the still, baked air. Silas McCrae swung a leg over the saddle, his boots landing with a soft thud that seemed too loud in the quiet of the afternoon. He stood for a moment, letting the ache in his bones settle, and looked at the town. Bramble Creek. The name was fitting. It looked like a place that had been left to dry up and curl in on itself. A tangle of sun-bleached wood and broken promises. The main street was a wide gash of pale dirt, rutted and hard as stone. On either side, buildings leaned against each other for support, their false fronts peeling like old skin. The paint on the sign for the general store was a ghost, its letters barely whispering their purpose. There was a livery, a blacksmith whose hammer was silent, and a saloon with bat-wing doors that hung crooked, like a broken jaw. Everything seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a wind that would finally be strong enough to blow it all away. Silas ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in his own ears. He was looking for two things: work that would fill his belly and a quiet that would soothe his soul. The first seemed possible. The second, he had learned long ago, was a rarer commodity than gold. He led his mare, Daisy, toward the livery, the slow clop of her hooves the only sound to challenge the silence. An old man with a face like a dried apple emerged from the shadows, took the reins without a word, and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Payment was exchanged in the same silent language of nods and grunts. With his horse settled, Silas walked toward the saloon. A man needed water, and sometimes the saloon was the only place to get it without inviting a dozen questions. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap whiskey. It was mostly empty. A few grim-faced men sat hunched over a table in the corner, their eyes flicking toward him before returning to their cards. The bartender, a heavy man with a damp apron stretched tight over his gut, wiped a glass with a rag that had seen better days. Silas ordered a water. He drank it slow, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, his back to the wall. He was a listener, a watcher. It was how he had survived. He learned the town's name from the label on a whiskey bottle behind the bar, Thatcher's Reserve. He learned who ran the town when one of the card players threw down his hand in disgust. "Thatcher takes it all anyway," the man grumbled, his voice low and bitter. The other men shushed him with nervous glances toward the door. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Leland Thatcher. Silas had heard the name before, whispered in other towns down the line. A man who owned land, cattle, and, some said, people. He was about to leave when the saloon doors were kicked open from the inside. Swinging out into the street with a violent crash, a big, thick-necked man with a florid face was shoving a woman ahead of him. She stumbled on the boardwalk, her worn dress catching on a splintered plank. "I told you to keep your mouth shut," the man snarled, his voice a low rumble of menace. The woman didn't answer. She was trying to regain her footing, her head held high, though a tremor ran through her thin frame. She was beautiful, in the way a wildflower that pushes through cracked earth is beautiful. Her dark hair was coiled loosely at the nape of her neck, with stray strands clinging to her temples. Her face was pale, her eyes a deep, stormy gray that held a universe of pain and defiance. "You don't look at me like that, girl," the man said, his voice rising. "You belong to Mr. Thatcher. You do as you're told." She finally looked at him, and her silence was more potent than any shout. It was a silence that condemned him, that refused to break. For that, he drew back his hand and slapped her, hard. The sound was a flat, ugly crack in the afternoon quiet. Her head snapped to the side, and she staggered back, catching herself on a hitching post. She didn't cry out. She just stood there, one hand rising slowly to her cheek, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the dusty street. Something inside Silas, a cold, familiar anger, uncoiled in his gut, It was the reason he kept moving, the thing he was always riding away from. He saw his own failure in that slap, the echo of a time he had stood by and done nothing. He moved before he had fully decided to. He was outside, standing between the man and the woman, his shadow falling over them both. He hadn't made a sound, but his presence was enough. The big man turned, his eyes narrowing. "This ain't your concern, drifter." Silas's voice was low, devoid of emotion. "That's enough." He didn't raise it, didn't posture. His hands were loose at his sides, nowhere near the Colt holstered on his hip. His power was in his stillness, in the cold certainty in his eyes that promised he was capable of finishing whatever started. The man, whose name Silas would later learn was Cole, was used to fear. He wasn't used to this quiet refusal to be intimidated. He sized Silas up. The lean frame, the worn clothes, the dusty hat pulled low. He saw a man with nothing to lose, and that was a dangerous thing. Cole hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching. He glanced at the woman, then back at Silas. With a final, contemptuous sneer, he spat on the ground. "She's Thatcher's property. You remember that?" He turned and stomped back into the saloon, letting the doors swing shut behind him. The street was quiet again. Silas turned to the woman, Clara Devlin. He didn't know her name yet, only the shape of her pain. He reached out a hand to help steady her. "Are you all right, ma'am?" She flinched at his touch, pulling her arm away as if his hand were hot iron. She straightened up on her own, her shoulders squared. She looked at him for a single, searing moment. Her gray eyes were not grateful. They were guarded, weary, and filled with an ancient distrust. She saw a man, and men were the architects of her misery. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate, down the dusty street toward a row of small, grim-looking cabins on the edge of town. She did not look back. Silas watched her go, the dust settling around his boots. He had offered help, and she had refused it. He understood. In a place like this, kindness was a currency more suspicious than coin. It always came with a price. He found lodging at a boarding house at the far end of the street, a clean, quiet place run by a widow named Martha Gable. She was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and hands that were never still. She took one look at Silas, at the exhaustion etched around his eyes and the decency he couldn't quite hide, and gave him a room for a fair price. That evening, as he sat at her kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee, she spoke in a low, careful voice. "You're the one who stood up to Cole." News traveled fast in a small town. Silas just nodded, sipping his coffee. "That was a fool thing to do," she said, but there was no judgment in her tone. "A decent thing, but a fool thing." She paused, wiping down the clean countertop with a cloth. "That girl, Clara, you'd be wise to stay clear of her, of all of them." "All of who?" Silas asked. "Thatcher's girls," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He brings them in from all over, girls with no family, no money. He gives them a place to stay, food to eat, and a contract. Says they're servants, working off a debt, but it's not a debt you can ever pay off." She looked him straight in the eye, her meaning clear and grim. "They're his property, just like his cattle, and he don't take kindly to anyone interfering with his property." The next day, Silas found work at the cattle pens just outside of town. The labor was hard and honest, wrestling steers into dusty enclosures, the sun beating down on his neck. It was the kind of work that tired a man's body and left his mind blessedly empty. But his mind was not empty. He kept seeing a pair of stormy gray eyes, filled with a defiance that had not yet been beaten out of them. The men he worked with were rough and tired. Their talk centered on cattle, cards, and women. They talked about Clara. They spoke of her beauty, but not with admiration. They spoke of it as a commodity, something to be appraised. "Heard Thatcher's got a buyer coming in," one of them said, leaning on a fence post to wipe sweat from his brow. "A mining man from Arizona. looking for new attractions for his camps. "He's selling one of the girls?" another asked. "The quiet one, Clara," the first man confirmed. "Heard she's grown too sullen for his tastes. Thatcher's parading her at a private dinner tonight, an auction, of a sort." The men chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Silas felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He kept working, his movements steady, betraying none of the cold rage that was building inside him. He pictured her in a fine dress, sitting silent while men negotiated her price, and the image made him sick. That night, he couldn't rest. The widow's house was quiet, but the town was not. Faint sounds of piano music and coarse laughter drifted from the saloon. He walked outside, needing the cool night air. The moon was a pale sliver in a sea of stars. And then he saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the boardwalk in the deep shadows between two buildings. Not far from the saloon, she was just a silhouette, a figure of profound loneliness. She was staring out at the dark horizon, toward the vast, empty plains, as if she could see a way out. He approached slowly, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. He didn't want to startle her. He stopped a few feet away, holding his canteen. "Thirsty?" he asked, his voice quiet. She turned her head, her face a pale oval in the gloom. She looked at the canteen, then back at him. Her eyes were full of suspicion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, her voice was a near whisper, raspy from disuse. "You first." It was a test, a demand. In her world, a drink from a stranger could be drugged, a prelude to something worse. He understood immediately. He didn't hesitate. He uncapped the canteen, tipped it back, and took a long drink, the cool water a relief in his dry throat. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and held it out to her again. This time, she took it. Her fingers brushed against his, and he felt a tremor in her touch. She drank, her movements careful and deliberate. When she was done, she handed it back, her eyes never leaving his face. She was trying to read him, to understand why he was showing her a kindness she had not asked for. He learned more about her from Martha Gable the following evening. He asked about the girl with the dark hair and the widow, sensing the cause of his interest, told him what she knew. "Her name is Clara Devlin," Martha said, her voice soft with pity. "Her family had a small farmstead a few miles east of here. Good people. A fire took the place a few years back, took her folks and her brother with it. She was 17, left with nothing but smoke and ashes." She sighed, her hands twisting in her apron. "Leland Thatcher's father was the one who found her, offered to take her in, give her a place. He had her sign one of his contracts. She didn't know any better, thought it was kindness. By the time the old man died and Leland took over, it was too late. She's been with him ever since, passed around when he sees fit. She's a ghost of the girl she was." As Martha spoke, an old memory, sharp and jagged, pushed its way into Silas's mind. He was a boy, no more than 10, hidden behind a rain barrel. He smelled gunpowder and fear. He saw his mother standing on the porch of their small cabin, her face pale but her chin held high, facing down 2 men who had come to claim their land. They had a piece of paper they said was legal. She said it was a lie. He remembered the sound of the shot, a deafening crack that stole the air from his lungs. He remembered watching her fall, a stain of red spreading across her simple cotton dress. He remembered the metallic taste of his own terror. He had stood frozen, hidden in the shadows, his feet rooted to the spot, while the life bled out of the only person who had ever loved him. He had not made a sound. He had not run for help. He had just watched. The shame of that memory was a constant companion, a weight he carried with every mile he rode. He had sworn an oath to his mother's ghost that he would never again stand by while injustice was done. He had spent his adult life trying to keep that promise, stepping in where he could, but never staying. Attachments were a liability. They were a weakness that men like Thatcher could exploit. A quiet tension began to weave itself between him and Clara in the days that followed. He would see her on the street, and their eyes would meet for a moment longer than was necessary. He'd be mending a fence, and he'd look up to see her watching from the window of the small cabin she shared with 2 other girls. She still refused to speak to him, still shied away from any direct kindness, but she no longer fled. She lingered. Her presence was a silent question, and his was a silent answer. One night, nearly a week after he had arrived, a cold wind blew down from the mountains, bringing with it the first real chill of the coming autumn. The sounds from the saloon were louder than usual. Silas was walking back from the livery when he saw her. She was standing outside the saloon, pressed back into the shadows of the overhang, her arms wrapped around herself. She was shivering, but he knew it was not just from the cold. He stopped a few feet from her. He had a blanket roll on his saddle, but he knew better than to offer it. It would be another kindness she felt forced to refuse. So he just stood there with her, sharing the cold silence, a silent guardian in the dark. After a long time, she spoke. Her voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it over the wind. "You shouldn't be kind to me." He looked at her, at the proud, broken line of her profile against the faint light from the saloon window. "Why not?" he asked, his voice just as quiet. She turned her head to look at him, her gray eyes dark with a pain so deep he felt it in his own chest. "Because it makes it harder." The work at the cattle pens ended as all such work did, with the last steer sold and the last dollar paid. Silas found himself with coin in his pocket and time on his hands, a combination that always made him uneasy. He could ride on, leave Bramble Creek and its ghosts in his dust, but the thought of Clara Devlin's stormy eyes held him fast. He was not a man to leave a thing unfinished, and this felt dangerously unfinished. He took a job hauling lumber for a new bunkhouse being built on the far side of town. The work was grueling, the pay was fair, and it gave him a clear view of the road leading up to Leland Thatcher's estate. The main house sat on a low rise overlooking the valley, a 2-story monument to one man's greed, its white paint a stark and mocking challenge to the dusty brown of the land it lorded over. From his wagon, Silas saw the carriages arrive one evening. They were fine, black lacquered things, pulled by horses that were better fed than most of the town's children. Men in dark suits and city hats stepped out, their boots polished to a high shine. Leland Thatcher himself emerged to greet them, a man of medium height but with a presence that seemed to suck the air from around him. He smiled, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. And then Silas saw Clara. She was brought out onto the veranda, positioned near the door like a piece of fine statuary. She was wearing a dress the color of fresh blood. The fabric clung to her thin frame, a startling splash of color against her pale skin. Her dark hair was piled high on her head in an elaborate style that looked both beautiful and painful. She stood utterly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. She was a painting of a woman, not a real one. She was an object on display, a part of the estate's curated wealth. Silas watched as the men's eyes slid over her, their expressions a mixture of appraisal and ownership. They nodded, their gazes lingering before they followed Thatcher inside for dinner. The heavy oak door closed, shutting her out of their world and yet sealing her fate within it. He sat on his lumber wagon, the rough wood biting into his hands, and felt a cold, familiar helplessness creep into his bones. He was a man with a gun and 2 strong hands, yet against the power of signed papers and cold money, he was nothing. He was just a boy again, hiding behind a barrel, watching a tragedy unfold. It was 2 nights later when she found him. He was in the livery, checking on Daisy, running a brush over her coarse coat in the dim lantern light. He heard a footstep, softer than a whisper, and turned. Clara stood in the doorway, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her silhouette framed by the star-dusted night sky. "They are sending me away," she said. There was no preamble, no greeting. Her voice was flat, a statement of fact stripped of all emotion. Silas stopped brushing the horse. He laid the brush aside, his movements slow and deliberate. When? In a week, to a mining camp in Arizona. She stepped further into the barn, into the small circle of golden light. He could see the tremor in her hands, the only betrayal of the terror she must be feeling. I heard them talking, the man from the mine. He told Mr. Thatcher I would be a good fit. For the men there, he said a quiet woman is better, less trouble. The words hung in the quiet, dusty air. He could picture the place, a raw camp carved into a mountainside, filled with desperate men and devoid of hope. It was a death sentence, a slow one. "He is selling me because I have grown too quiet," she said, and for the first time, a note of bitter irony entered her voice. "He bought me for my silence, and now he sells me for it." Silas moved closer, stopping a few feet from her. "I can help you get away from here." The offer was simple, the words spoken with a low, steady certainty. But Clara recoiled as if he had struck her. Fear, raw and sharp, flashed in her eyes. It was not a fear of Thatcher, but a fear of his promise, a fear of hope. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You cannot. Clara, I have tried before." She cut him off, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "Years ago, there was a man, a ranch hand. He was kind, like you. He saw what this place was. He said he would help me. We made it almost to the county line." She paused, her gaze dropping to the hay-strewn floor. "They caught us, Thatcher's men. They did not bring the man back." Her voice broke on the last word. "He died because of me." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "They will kill you, and it will be for nothing. I will still be here, or I will be in Arizona. Nothing will change. Do you understand? Nothing ever changes." The story landed on Silas like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It was his own past, his own failure, thrown back at him in this dark, quiet barn. The memory he always carried was suddenly vivid, the details sharp as broken glass. He had been a deputy in a Texas county that bordered the territories. A young man, barely 23, full of a naive belief in the law. A woman had come into his office. A girl, really. No older than Clara was now. Her name was Elena. She had come with her family from Mexico, and they had signed a labor contract with a powerful landowner. The contract was written in English, which they could not read. It bound them to his service for 10 years to pay off the cost of their passage. It was indenture, slavery by another name, but the law upheld it. Elena had come to him with bruises on her arms and a desperate plea in her dark eyes. The landowner's son had been visiting her cabin at night. Her father had tried to stop him and had been beaten for his trouble. Silas had wanted to ride out there, to arrest the boy, to tear up the damned contract, but the sheriff, an old, weary man who had seen it all, had stopped him. He had pulled the contract from a file. "It's legal, son," the sheriff had said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The contract gives him authority over his workers. We can warn the boy, tell him to be more discreet, but that's all. Our hands are tied. If you go out there making a fuss, the law will be on his side, not yours." Silas had argued, his voice full of youthful fire and outrage. He had spoken of justice, of right and wrong. The sheriff had just looked at him with sad eyes. "Justice is a luxury we ain't got here. Silas, we got the law, and the law belongs to the men who can afford to write it." Silas had backed down. He had followed orders. He had stood by. 2 weeks later, Elena's family had tried to run. They were caught near the river. The landowner claimed they had stolen from him. In the fight that followed, Elena's father was shot. Elena herself was taken back to the ranch. Silas never saw her again, but he heard the stories. He turned in his badge the next day and had been riding ever since. The ghost of Elena a constant shadow at his back. He had failed her. He would not fail Clara. He looked at her now, standing in the lantern light, so convinced of her own damnation. "It is different this time," he said, his voice raw with a conviction born of old shame.
How?
She challenged, her voice a whisper of defiance.
How is it different? You are one man. He is a king here.
To answer, she did something that stunned him into silence. She slowly, deliberately, pushed up the sleeve of her worn dress. On the pale skin of her upper arm, there was a scar. It was not a clean line from a knife, but a puckered, ugly mark, the kind of scar left by a hot piece of iron. It was a brand. "This is what happens when you run," she said, her voice devoid of self-pity. It was the same tone she might have used to comment on the weather. "A reminder, so you do not forget who you belong to." Silas looked at the scar, at that obscene mark of ownership on her skin, and the cold anger inside him began to burn hot. It was a clean, purifying fire. It burned away his doubt, his caution, his fear. He reached out, his calloused fingers hovering just over the scar, not quite touching it. He was giving her the choice to pull away. She stood her ground, her breathing shallow. His fingers gently touched her skin, not the scar, but the soft flesh beside it. It was a touch of profound respect, an acknowledgement of her pain that asked for nothing in return. And she let him. She stood perfectly still and let him touch her. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment of contact in the vast, lonely darkness of their lives. But it was everything. In that shared silence, a bond was forged. A fragile thread of trust spun in the gloom of the livery. He finally let his hand drop. He could think of nothing to say that would be adequate. So he said nothing. He simply stood with her, a silent witness to her truth. A few days later, he saw her again in the same barn. She was there alone, mending a horse blanket, her fingers moving with a practiced, absent-minded rhythm. He approached quietly and sat on a nearby hay bale. For a long time, they existed in a comfortable silence. The only sounds, the rustle of the hay and the soft snorts of the horses in their stalls. She finally spoke, her eyes still on her work.
"My mother loved to sing,"
she said, her voice soft and distant, as if pulling the memory from a deep well.
"She had a beautiful voice.
She would sing old hymns while she worked in her garden. I cannot remember the last time I heard music that was not from a saloon piano." Silas listened, knowing that this was a gift, another piece of herself that she was entrusting to him. "My father used to whittle," he offered in return. He could make anything out of a piece of wood. Birds, horses, little figures of people. He made me a soldier once. I kept it in my pocket until the paint wore off. They exchanged these small, simple memories, pieces of a life before it had all gone wrong. It was a way of showing each other that they had not always been this way, that there had been a time of sunlight and singing mothers and fathers with clever hands. As she finished her mending, she looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and direct. "In all my life," she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean forward to hear, "no man has ever kissed me without a price attached. Not once." The confession was laid bare between them, a statement of such profound sadness that it physically hurt him to hear it. He saw the years of her life stretching behind her, a wasteland of transactional affection, of her body being used as currency. He saw the shame she carried, a weight that was not hers to bear. He stood up and walked over to her. She looked up at him, her expression guarded, uncertain of what he would do. He knelt in the hay in front of her, so their eyes were level. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. She flinched for a second, then held still, her eyes wide, searching his. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. He did not kiss her lips. Instead, he pressed his mouth gently to her forehead, a kiss that was a blessing, a promise, a prayer. It was a kiss of absolute respect, a gesture that said, "You are not an object, you are a person, you are worthy of tenderness." He held it there for a long moment, then pulled back. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She simply looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw a flicker of something he had not seen before, It was not hope. Not yet. It was the possibility of hope. The quiet moments could not last. The tension in Bramble Creek was a string pulled taut, ready to snap. It snapped one night behind the general store. Clara had been sent on an errand, and Silas, by chance or by instinct, was nearby. He saw Cole, the thick-necked man from the saloon, step out of the shadows with another of Thatcher's men. They blocked her path. "Evening, Clara," Cole said with a greasy smile. "Mister, Thatcher is wondering where you've been spending your evenings. Getting a little too friendly with that drifter, ain't you?" Clara tried to step around them, her face a pale, emotionless mask.
"I have to get back."
"Not so fast," the other man said, grabbing her arm. "We think you need a reminder of the rules." That was when Silas stepped out from the side of the building. "Let her go," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Cole's smile widened. "Well, look who it is. Come to play the hero?" He shoved Clara behind him, toward the other man. "This has been coming for a while." Silas did not waste time with words. He moved fast, driving his fist into Cole's soft gut. The man grunted, doubling over, and Silas brought his other fist down on the back of his neck. But the second man was on him, a big, brawling fighter who swung a haymaker that caught Silas on the side of the head, sending stars exploding behind his eyes. He staggered back, shaking his head to clear it. Cole was back on his feet, and now it was 2 against 1. They closed in, their fists like hammers. Silas fought back with a cold, desperate fury. He was a good fighter, quick and smart, but the odds were against him. He landed a solid blow to the second man's jaw, felt the satisfying crunch of bone. But then Cole caught him with a kick to the ribs that stole his breath and sent a searing pain through his side. He went down on one knee. He saw Clara, her face a mask of horror, screaming his name. Cole laughed and landed another brutal kick to his stomach. Silas crumpled to the ground, the world dissolving into a haze of pain. He heard Cole's voice from far away. "That's a message from Mr. Thatcher. Next time, we won't stop." He felt a final, vicious kick to his head, and then the world went black. He came to in a soft bed, in a small, clean room. The first thing he was aware of was the throbbing in his head and the fire in his ribs. The second was a cool cloth on his forehead. He opened his eyes, wincing at the dim lamplight. Clara was sitting in a chair beside the bed. They were in his room at Martha Gable's boarding house. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes dark and wide. She was dabbing his split lip with a damp rag. "Martha let me in the back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She said she would keep watch." He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a sharp stab of pain in his side pushed him back down. He grunted, closing his eyes. "Just lie still," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Your ribs are bruised. Maybe one is cracked. Your face," she trailed off, her touch on his forehead feather light. He opened his eyes again and looked at her, really looked at her, in her worry. He saw how much she had come to care. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling. He reached up and caught her hand, his grip weak but firm. She did not pull away. "I'm not leaving this time," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. It was a promise, an oath. It was the answer to her fear, to his own past. Clara did not reply. She simply squeezed his hand, her answer in the steady pressure of her fingers. A single tear escaped and traced a silver path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She stayed by his side all night, a silent guardian in the dim, quiet room, watching over the man who had refused to leave her to the wolves. The sheriff came the next morning. Silas was sitting up in bed, his ribs tightly bound, a cup of Martha's stale coffee in his hand. The sheriff, a man named Eli Vance, was old and stooped, with a drooping mustache that seemed to carry the weight of all the town's sorrows. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his gaze shifting from Silas's battered face to Clara, who stood by the window like a cornered doe. "Son," Vance said, his voice a dry rasp, "you need to leave Bramble Creek today." "I'm not done here," Silas said, his voice low. The sheriff took a hesitant step into the room. "You are. This is a hornet's nest you're kicking. Leland Thatcher runs this town. He owns the land, the water, the law. That contract he has on this girl," he nodded toward Clara, "it's ironclad. I've seen it myself. It'll hold up in any court in this territory." "Some laws ain't worth the paper they're written on," Silas countered, his eyes cold. "Maybe so," Vance conceded with a weary sigh. "But they're the laws we got. This ain't your fight. In the eyes of the law, she belongs to Thatcher. You getting yourself killed won't change that." The words, "belongs to Thatcher," were a spark on dry tinder. The old shame, the old failure, rose in Silas like a bitter tide. He looked at Clara, then back at the sheriff, a man who wore a badge but carried the same air of weary resignation as the lawman he himself had once served. "I used to wear a badge like yours," Silas said, his voice quiet but intense. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. "Down in Texas, I believed in the law, too. I believed it was a shield for the innocent. Then a family came through, signed one of those contracts. The landowner who held their paper. He was a man like Thatcher. He saw his workers as property. He let his son use one of the daughters. A girl named Elena. I tried to intervene. I was told the law was on his side, that the contract gave him rights. I was told to stand down." Silas's knuckles were white where he gripped the coffee cup. "I stood down. I followed the law. The family tried to run. The girl's father was killed. I never saw her again. I took off my badge and I ain't looked back. So you see, Sheriff, I've seen this fight before. I lost it once. I won't lose it again." Sheriff Vance stood there for a long moment, the tin star on his chest seeming to weigh him down. He saw the truth in Silas's eyes, the conviction of a man haunted by his own ghosts. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in sorrow. "Thatcher will kill you," he said, his voice a near whisper. Then he turned and left, his footsteps heavy on the boarding house stairs. In the silence that followed, Clara came and sat on the edge of the bed. The air was thick with his confession, with the ghosts of his past. He had shown her his deepest wound, the source of his own private shame. Now, she showed him hers. "My mother was sick for a long time," she began, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. She did not look at him, but at her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "The winter was hard, and we had no money for a doctor. Our cabin was cold. The dampness got into her lungs. I went to the Thatcher house. Leland's father, Abram, was alive then. He was a hard man, but people said he was a good Christian." She took a shaky breath. "I begged him for help, for a loan, for a doctor, anything. He told me our troubles were not his concern. The church was empty that winter, the preacher having moved on. I took my mother there, to the cellar. It was out of the wind. I thought maybe God would help where man would not." Her voice cracked. "She died on the dirt floor of that cellar. I was holding her hand. After the burial, Abram Thatcher came to me. He said he had heard of my plight and would offer me a place in his household, to work off the debt of his charity. There was no charity. There was no debt, but I had nothing. No one. So I signed his paper." She finally looked at him, her gray eyes swimming with unshed tears. "He owned me from the moment my mother died, maybe even before." Silas reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold as ice. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He simply held her hand, a silent promise that her pain was now his to carry, too. In the days that followed, as his body slowly healed, a fragile intimacy grew between them in the confines of the small room. Martha brought them meals, her face a mixture of worry and fierce approval. Clara tended to his wounds, her touch growing less hesitant each day. She would change the dressing on his ribs, her fingers brushing against his skin, and a current would pass between them, potent and unspoken. He would watch her as she sat by the window, mending one of his shirts, the afternoon light catching the dark sheen of her hair, and a feeling would swell in his chest that felt dangerously like hope. They moved around each other in a careful dance of growing affection. He would reach out and tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She would let her hand rest on his shoulder for a moment too long. The space between them seemed charged, humming with a desire that was both terrifying and beautiful. But Silas never pushed. He remembered the brand on her arm, the confession in the barn. He knew that for her, a man's touch had always been a thing of violence and obligation. He would not be another man who took. He would let her lead. He would let her choose. One evening, he was well enough to sit in the chair while she sat on the bed. The room was cast in the warm, flickering glow of a single lantern. The silence was comfortable, easy. He could feel her gaze on him, and he looked up to meet her eyes. There was a question in them, and a deep, profound vulnerability.
I don't want to feel ashamed after,
she whispered, the words a stark, painful admission of her deepest fear. Silas felt his heart ache for her. He understood completely. She was not talking about sin or propriety. She was talking about the residue of trauma, the shame that had been branded onto her soul along with the scar on her arm. He rose from his chair and knelt before her, just as he had in the barn. He took her hands in his. They were steady now, and warm. He looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the truth of his words. "Then I'll wait," he said, his voice soft but absolute. "I'll wait until you don't." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time she was smiling. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Their quiet sanctuary was shattered 2 days later. The front door of the boarding house burst open with a splintering crash. Heavy boots stomped into the hall below. "We know she's in here! Martha!" It was Cole's voice, thick with menace. "Thatcher wants his property back. Send her out, or we're coming in to get her." Clara's face went white with terror. She flew to the door of the room, bolting it. She turned to Silas, her eyes wide with panic. "You have to go," she pleaded, her voice a frantic whisper. "Out the window. You can get away. Please, Silas. Don't let them kill you because of me. I will go back. I will be all right." Silas stood up, his body still aching but his resolve like granite. He went to her, taking her by the shoulders. "Look at me, Clara. I am not leaving you. Not now. Not ever. We are leaving together." Martha's voice rose from downstairs, brave and defiant. "You'll do no such thing. This is a respectable house. I'll have the sheriff on you." "The sheriff works for Mr. Thatcher," Cole roared, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing against the stairs. There was no more time. Silas grabbed his gun belt from the bedpost, strapping it on. He threw their meager belongings, his saddlebags, her small bundle of clothes, into a single sack. "The back window," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock for her to cling to. "It leads to the alley. The livery is at the end. Can you ride?" She nodded, her fear giving way to a desperate, wild courage. He helped her out the window, dropping her gently to the ground below before swinging himself out after her. The sounds of splintering wood came from his room as Thatcher's men broke down the door. They ran, hand in hand, down the dark, narrow alley, their footsteps echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence. At the livery, Martha's boy, a lad of about 15, was waiting with 2 saddled horses. The widow had planned for this. "Godspeed," the boy whispered, pressing the reins into their hands. They mounted and kicked the horses into a gallop, thundering out of the back of the livery and into the open darkness, away from the town. Shouts erupted behind them, followed by the sharp crack of a pistol shot, the bullet whining harmlessly into the night. They rode hard, the wind tearing at their faces. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and a cold, biting rain began to fall. It started as a drizzle, then intensified into a driving downpour, soaking them to the bone in minutes. The ground turned to slick mud, and the horses struggled for footing. Clara rode beside him, her face set, her body bent against the wind and the rain. He saw in her a strength she had probably never known she possessed. After what felt like hours, she pulled her horse closer to his, shouting over the roar of the storm.
"There was an old homestead, my grandfather's, not far from here, up in the hills. There might be shelter."
He nodded, and she took the lead, guiding them off the main track and up a treacherous, rocky path. The world was a maelstrom of wind, rain, and darkness. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief, brilliant flash, Silas saw the ruin of a cabin ahead, its roof caved in on one side, a dark, gaping hole where the door used to be. It was not much, but it was shelter. They half led, half dragged the exhausted horses into the lean-to that still stood at the side of the cabin, then stumbled inside the main structure themselves. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and rotting wood. Rain dripped through the broken roof, but one corner remained relatively dry. They collapsed onto the dirt floor, shivering, their teeth chattering. Silas fumbled in his saddlebags, his fingers numb with cold. He found his tinderbox and a stub of a candle. After several frustrating attempts, a small, brave flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. In the candlelight, he saw her. Her hair was plastered to her face, her dress was soaked through, and she was shaking uncontrollably. But her eyes, fixed on his, were alive with a fierce, desperate light. He took off his wet jacket and wrapped it around her, pulling her close. They huddled together in the small circle of light, sharing their body heat, listening to the storm rage outside. The world had been reduced to this single point of light, this fragile shelter, this shared breath. She reached up and touched his face, her cold fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He was bruised and battered, and he had thrown away what little safety he had for her. He had faced down Thatcher's men, the law, and now the storm itself, all for her. She leaned in, her lips close to his ear, and her whisper was nearly lost in the sound of the rain. "I don't want you to leave after this." It was her surrender. It was her declaration. It was her choice. He turned his face to hers, and in the golden candlelight, he kissed her. It was a kiss born of desperation and relief, of shared pain and a dawning, terrifying hope. It was a kiss that sealed the promise he had made in the sick room. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shaky. He gently laid her back on his dry bedroll, which he had spread in the driest corner. He lay down beside her, pulling the thin wool blanket over them both. Their love-making was as gentle and as powerful as the storm outside. It was a quiet, reverent exploration, a shedding of old skins and old shames. For Silas, it was an act of devotion to the fierce, brave woman beside him. For Clara, in the flickering candlelight of a ruined cabin, held by a man who had asked for nothing and offered everything. It was the first time in her life she felt not used, but chosen. It was the first time she did not feel ashamed. They fell asleep in each other's arms, the candle burning down to a sputtering wick, the rain finally softening to a gentle patter. For a few short hours, in the heart of the storm, they had found peace. But the world outside had not forgotten them. Silas awoke to the first pale light of dawn. The storm had passed. A sliver of sun cut through a break in the clouds, sending a single dusty ray of light into the cabin. Clara was still asleep, her face soft and peaceful in a way he had never seen before. He felt a fierce, protective love for her that was so strong it was a physical ache in his chest. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a horse's whinny, too close to be their own. He was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand. He moved to the gaping doorway, peering out. 3 riders sat on their horses at the edge of the clearing, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. Thatcher's men. He backed away from the door, his heart pounding. Clara was awake, her eyes wide with the same terror that had gripped her in the boarding house. He put a finger to his lips, motioning for her to stay down.
There was no escape. They were trapped.
A voice called out, cold and mocking. "We know you're in there. McCrae! Send out the girl and we might let you live." Silas knew it was a lie. He looked at Clara, at the life and the light he had just seen return to her eyes. He would not let them take her back to the darkness. He raised his Colt, his hand steady. "Stay behind me," he whispered to her. He took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway. The world erupted in a deafening crack of gunfire. The bullet hit him like a blacksmith's hammer, a white-hot tearing pain that ripped through his left arm and shoulder. The force of it spun him around and threw him back into the cabin. He landed hard on the dirt floor, his Colt clattering from his numb fingers. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Clara scream his name, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that was worse than any physical pain. He pushed himself up onto his good elbow, his vision swimming. He saw two of Thatcher's men storm the cabin. One of them grabbed Clara. His rough hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her screams. She fought, her body a blur of desperate, thrashing limbs, her eyes wide and locked on Silas. The other man stood over him, leveling his pistol. Silas stared up the black barrel of the gun, a strange calm settling over him. He had failed. He had made a promise, and he had failed. He saw Clara's eyes, saw the moment her fight broke, the moment the hope he had given her was extinguished, replaced by the old, familiar despair. They were dragging her out of the cabin, her feet scrambling for purchase in the mud. "I don't want you to leave after this," her last words to him, a whisper in the storm, now echoed as a cruel, final taunt. The man holding the gun smiled, a yellow, broken-toothed thing. "Thatcher sends his regards." Silas closed his eyes, waiting for the end. A shot cracked through the morning air, but it wasn't the one he was expecting. The man above him grunted, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before he pitched forward, landing in a heap beside Silas. Another shot followed, and one of the men outside, the one holding Clara's horse, cried out and fell from his saddle. The man holding Clara cursed, shoving her toward the remaining rider. "Get her on the horse! Go!" He fired a wild shot back in the direction the help had come from before scrambling onto his own mount. Silas, his mind reeling, forced himself to his knees. He saw them, a single rider galloping away into the trees, dragging Clara's horse behind him. She was slumped in the saddle, a prisoner once more, her head bowed in defeat. He tried to stand, to shout her name, but the world tilted and dissolved into a dark, roaring vortex. His last conscious thought was of her face, of the light he had seen in her, now gone. He awoke to the taste of bitter herbs and the feeling of a cool, wet cloth on his forehead. He was lying on a simple cot in a small, clean room. Sunlight streamed through a single, deep-set window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. His arm was bound tightly to his chest, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated from his shoulder. A woman sat in a chair beside him, her hands busy with a needle and thread. She was older, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a severe bun. She looked up and saw his eyes were open. "So, you returned to us," she said, her voice soft, with a gentle Spanish accent. "It is good. My husband was not sure you would—" "Where?" Silas began, his voice a dry croak. "You are safe," she said, setting her sewing aside and offering him a cup of water. "You are in our home. My husband, Mateo, he found you. He was hunting in the hills. He is the one who drove them off." Silas drank the water, the cool liquid a balm to his parched throat. "Clara, the woman who was with me." The woman's kind face clouded with sorrow. "They took her. There was only one of him, and two of them. He could not stop them both. I am sorry." The words were a stone in his gut. He had known, but hearing it confirmed made it real. He closed his eyes. The image of Clara being dragged away, burning behind his lids. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over him. He spent the next days in a feverish haze, drifting in and out of consciousness. The woman, whose name was Elena, and her husband, Matteo, tended to him with a quiet, patient care. Matteo was a stoic man with kind eyes and hands as tough as old leather. He would check Silas's wound, his touch surprisingly gentle, and speak in a low, rumbling Spanish that Silas only half understood but found comforting. During his lucid moments, Elena would tell him their story. They had a small farm, a few goats, a patch of corn, nestled in a hidden valley where Thatcher's influence was a distant shadow. They spoke of their daughter, Rosita. She was beautiful, Elena said one afternoon, her eyes looking at something far away. Full of life, like a wildflower. She went into Bramble Creek to work, to send money home. She signed one of Thatcher's contracts. Elena's voice grew hard, the grief of years sharpening its edge. He worked her in the saloon, and then one day, a wealthy man came through, a man with interests in the silver mines. Thatcher sold her contract to him. We never saw Rosita again. We heard she did not last a year in that place. Matteo, who had been standing in the doorway, came into the room. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. Thatcher does not sell women, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He sells souls. Now Silas understood. Their kindness was not just for a stranger. It was for a man who was fighting the same devil that had stolen their daughter. They were bound by a shared enemy, a shared grief. As his fever broke and his strength slowly began to return, the full weight of his failure settled upon him. He would lie awake at night, the throbbing in his arm a dull counterpoint to the sharp agony in his soul. He was haunted by Clara's scream, by the terror in her eyes, and most of all, by her words. "I don't want you to leave after this." He had promised her a new life, a moment of peace, and he had led her right back into the cage, more broken than before. The guilt was a physical thing, a poison in his blood. One morning, Matteo helped him outside for the first time. The sun was warm on his face, but he felt a chill deep in his bones. He walked, his steps unsteady, back toward the ruined cabin. It was a pilgrimage to the site of his failure. The bodies of the two men he had killed were gone, but the ground was trampled and stained with old blood. He knelt in the mud where Clara had been taken, his head bowed. His fingers traced the outline of a horseshoe print, and then he saw it. Half buried in the dirt was a thin leather cord. He pulled it free. Hanging from it was a small, crudely carved bird, its wings outstretched. It was her necklace. He remembered seeing it around her neck. He closed his fist around it, the smooth wood a solid, real thing in his hand. It was a token of her trust, a trust he had betrayed. He held it tight, making a silent vow. He would get her back, or he would die in the attempt. While Silas recovered in the mountains, Clara descended into hell. She was thrown into the dark, damp cellar beneath Thatcher's main house. The place was cold and smelled of earth and decay. Her only companions were the rats that skittered in the darkness. She believed Silas was dead. She had seen him fall, had seen the man standing over him with the gun. The brief, beautiful flame of hope he had lit within her had been brutally snuffed out. There was nothing left but a cold, empty darkness. Thatcher came to see her once. He stood at the top of the cellar stairs, a lantern held high, his shadow looming over her like a demon's. "Your drifter is dead," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "He was a fool to interfere with my business. You belong to me, Clara. You always have." He told her the man from the Arizona mine was arriving in 3 days to collect her. She was to be cleaned up, put in a new dress, and delivered like a piece of livestock. Clara did not answer. She simply stared at the stone wall, her face a blank mask. From that moment on, she refused to eat, The food they left for her sat untouched, attracting flies. She refused to speak. When Cole or one of the others came to taunt her, she met their words with a profound, unnerving silence. She had retreated to a place deep inside herself where they could not reach her. If Silas was dead, then she would join him. It was her last, final act of defiance. In the mountains, Silas was preparing for war. His arm was still weak, but he worked it every day, pushing through the pain, his focus absolute. He practiced shooting with his good hand, his aim as true as ever. Mateo watched him, a silent, approving presence. He knew he could not take on Thatcher and his men alone. He needed weapons, and he needed a plan. He remembered seeing an old man in Bramble Creek, a man who sat on the porch of the blacksmith shop, his eyes distant, one leg missing below the knee. The townspeople gave him a wide berth. Silas had recognized him for what he was, a soldier, left behind by a war that was over for everyone but him. Silas rode back toward Bramble Creek, but not into it. He skirted the edges of town, moving through the twilight like a ghost, the wooden bird tucked safely inside his shirt. He found the old veteran, Jedediah, in his small shack behind the blacksmith's. Jedediah looked up as Silas entered, his eyes surprisingly sharp. "Heard you were dead," he grunted. "Not yet," Silas said. He laid a few coins on the table. "I need a rifle, a good one." Jedediah stared at him for a long moment. Then a slow, grim smile touched his lips. "I figured someone would get tired of Thatcher's brand of tyranny eventually." He hobbled over to a long wooden crate in the corner and pulled out a rifle. It was an old Sharps, heavy and well-oiled. A veteran of battles Silas could only imagine. "She'll shoot true to 500 yards, if you can hold her steady." "What are you planning, son?" "I'm getting back something he stole," Silas said. Jedediah nodded, a look of understanding in his old eyes. "Take it. No charge. Just make sure you point it in the right direction." His next stop was the back door of Martha Gable's boarding house. The widow gasped when she saw him, pulling him inside with a strength that belied her age. She wept with relief. Then her face hardened with anger.
"He has her locked in the cellar of the main house,"
she whispered, her voice trembling with rage.
"He's holding a big auction for some prize cattle in 2 days.
The mining man will be there. That's when he plans to hand her over." This was the opening Silas needed. A public event, a crowd, a distraction. He told her his plan, and her eyes lit up with a fierce, determined fire. She would talk to some of the other townsfolk, the ones who had suffered under Thatcher's thumb, the ones who had nothing left to lose. Mateo and his family would be ready in the hills. His last visit was to the sheriff. He found Eli Vance in his office late at night, staring into a half-empty whiskey bottle. "I told you to leave," Vance said, without looking up. "And I told you I wasn't finished," Silas replied, stepping into the room. "Thatcher is having her shipped out in 2 days. Legally, the contract is signed. There's nothing I can do." "I'm not asking you to do anything," Silas said, his voice low and even. "I'm not asking you to break the law. I'm just telling you that a higher law is about to be served in your town. You can stand with Thatcher, or you can stand aside." Silas placed the key to the back gate of Thatcher's estate on the desk. He had taken it from the man he had killed at the cabin. "I know you have a copy of this." Sheriff Vance stared at the key, then at Silas. He saw a man who was not asking for permission. He saw a man who was going to do this with or without his help. He saw the ghost of the young deputy Silas had once been, and the ghost of the lawman he himself had tried to be. He finally looked up, and the weariness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Defiance. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a key identical to the one Silas had presented, and pushed it across the desk. "The auction starts at noon, day after tomorrow," Vance said, his voice a low growl. "Most of his men will be there. The back gate is near the cellar entrance." He took a long drink of his whiskey and set the glass down with a thump. "You get one chance, McCrae. After that, I look the other way." The night was a sliver of a moon and a million cold stars. Silas moved through the long skeletal shadows cast by the cottonwood trees, his feet making no sound on the packed earth. The Thatcher estate was a dark mass on the hill, a sleeping beast with only a few lights burning in its windows. He moved like a wraith, a creature of the night, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He heard the distant stamp of a horse in the stable, the sighing of the wind through the eaves of the main house, the frantic beating of his own heart. He carried the old Sharps rifle across his back, its weight a grim comfort. In his hand was his Colt, its metal cool and solid against his palm. He reached the stone wall that marked the perimeter of the main yard, following it until he found the small, wrought iron gate that led to the back of the house. He had been here before, in his mind, 100 times over the past 2 days. He knew this gate. He knew the path that led from it to the slanted cellar doors. The key Sheriff Vance had given him slid into the lock with a faint metallic whisper. He turned it slowly, wincing at the soft click of the tumblers. He slipped through the gate, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, and made his way across the manicured lawn. 2 guards were stationed on the front veranda, their low voices a murmur on the night air. But the back of the house was quiet. He reached the cellar doors, knelt, and lifted the heavy wooden planks. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to scream in the stillness. He froze, listening, but no alarm was raised. Below him was a black square of absolute darkness. He replaced the doors, leaving a gap just wide enough to slip through, and descended the stone steps into the cold, musty air. The smell of damp earth, mildew, and despair filled his lungs. He pulled the doors shut above him, plunging himself into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. He stood for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, but there was no light to adjust to. He was blind. He lit the stub of the candle he had brought, its small flame pushing back the gloom, revealing stone walls slick with moisture and a hard-packed dirt floor. At the far end of the cellar, chained to the wall by her ankle, was Clara. She was lying on a thin pallet of straw, her face turned to the wall. She did not move. For a terrible, heart-stopping moment, he thought she was dead. He moved closer, his boots scuffing softly on the dirt. In her waking death, in the gray, featureless prison of her own mind, Clara heard a sound. She dismissed it. It was rats, or the groaning of the old house. She had been hearing things for days, her mother's voice, the sound of a gunshot, Silas whispering her name. They were tricks of a mind that was coming undone. But then the sound came again, closer this time, a soft, deliberate footstep. She did not turn. She did not have the strength or the will. She kept her eyes fixed on the damp patterns on the stone wall. Then, a faint, flickering light bloomed in the darkness, and a pair of worn, dust-caked boots stepped into her line of sight. They were familiar boots, boots that had stood between her and Cole in the street, boots that had walked beside her in the moonlight. She thought she was hallucinating, that her mind was creating one last, beautiful, cruel mirage before the end. She did not dare to look up. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the vision to disappear. But then a voice, real and solid and so close it made her heart leap, cut through the silence. It was a hoarse whisper, full of pain and exhaustion and an unbreakable promise. "Told you I'm not leaving." Her eyes flew open. She pushed herself up, her whole body trembling. It was him, Silas. He was kneeling in front of her, his face bruised and gaunt in the candlelight, his left arm bound tightly to his chest. But he was alive. He was here. The sight of him was so impossible, so overwhelming, that she could not speak. She could only stare, her breath catching in her throat. He gave her a small, tired smile and pulled a key from his pocket. He fitted into the lock on the heavy iron shackle around her ankle. The click of the lock opening was sharp and final. He pulled the chain free, and it fell to the dirt floor with a soft clatter. To Clara, it was the loudest sound she had ever heard. He had unlocked her chains. And in doing so, he had unlocked the world. He helped her to her feet. She was weak, unsteady. She clung to him, burying her face in his good shoulder, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. He held her, his one good arm wrapped around her, and for a moment, they just stood there in the flickering candlelight, two lost souls clinging to each other in the dark.
"We have to go,"
he whispered, his voice gentle but urgent. Just as he spoke, a faint orange glow flickered through the cracks in the cellar doors above them, followed by the distant, muffled sound of a shout. "That's our signal," Silas said. He helped her up the stone steps. They pushed the cellar doors open and were met by a scene of chaos. The stable, at the far end of the estate, was engulfed in flames. An angry orange pillar of fire and smoke clawed at the night sky. Men were shouting, running with buckets, their figures silhouetted against the blaze. The distraction, orchestrated by Martha and the townspeople, had begun. They crept along the side of the house, staying deep in the shadows. The front yard was a scene of confusion as men were roused from their beds. In the midst of it all, Leland Thatcher stood on the veranda, his face a mask of cold fury in the firelight. He was shouting orders, but his eyes were scanning the grounds, his mind clearly working, sensing that this was more than a simple stable fire. His gaze swept over the back of the house, and for a heart-stopping moment, Silas thought he had seen them, but then a section of the stable roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, drawing everyone's attention. They made it to the back gate, to where Silas had left their horses tethered in a small grove of trees. He helped Clara mount, then swung up behind her on his own horse, the Sharp's rifle bouncing against his back. Just as they spurred the horses into the darkness, a shout went up from the house. Thatcher had seen them. "There, after them!" The escape was a desperate, frantic gallop through the moonlit hills. Gunfire split the night behind them, the bullets whining through the air like angry hornets. They rode low over the horses' necks, pushing them to their limits. Silas held the reins with his good hand, his wounded arm a searing agony in its sling. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Clara's dress, grazing the flesh of her shoulder. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, but she did not falter. She gritted her teeth against the sting, her hands clutching the saddle horn, her body moving with the rhythm of the charging horse. She was no longer the fragile, broken thing from the cellar. She was a survivor, riding for her life. They reached the edge of a deep, rocky canyon, the path narrowing to a treacherous ledge. It was a dead end, but it was also defensible. "Get down!" Silas shouted, sliding from his horse. He helped her down, his face grim. "Get behind that boulder and stay there. Do not move, no matter what you hear." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, but for him. "Silas?" "Go, now!" he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. She scrambled behind a large granite boulder as their pursuers thundered into view. There were 4 of them, led by Cole, his face a twisted mask of rage in the moonlight. Silas stood his ground at the head of the narrow path, the heavy Sharp's rifle resting in the crook of his good arm. He was one man, wounded and exhausted, against 4, but he was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in the world. "That's far enough! Cole!" he yelled, his voice echoing across the canyon. Cole reined in his horse, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Nowhere left to run? McCrae, give us the girl, and Thatcher might let you die quick." "You'll have to come through me," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. He sighted down the long barrel of the Sharps and squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, its recoil a brutal shock against his wounded shoulder. One of the riders screamed and fell from his saddle. The other 2, unnerved, pulled back, firing wildly. Silas levered another round into the chamber and fired again. A second man's horse went down, trapping its rider. Cole and the remaining man dismounted, taking cover behind the rocks. It was a standoff. From behind her boulder, Clara could hear the crack of the rifle, the answering shots from the pistols, the ricochet of lead off stone. Each shot from the sharps was followed by a long silence as Silas reloaded, a silence that stretched her nerves to the breaking point. Then she heard Silas cry out in pain, peeking around the edge of the rock. She saw him stumble, clutching his side. He had been hit again. He was leaning against the canyon wall for support, his face pale, but the rifle was still steady in his hand. Cole saw his chance.
"He's hit!"
He yelled to his man.
"Let's finish this!"
They broke cover, charging forward. Silas fired the sharps one last time. The man beside Cole went down, clutching his leg, but Cole kept coming, his pistol blazing. Silas dropped the heavy rifle and drew his Colt, firing with his good hand. A bullet tore through Cole's arm, knocking the pistol from his grasp, but his momentum carried him forward. He crashed into Silas, and the two men went down in a brutal, close-quarters dance of death. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a brawl, a desperate struggle for survival fought with fists and knives and teeth. Cole was bigger and stronger, but Silas was fueled by a cold, deadly rage. He fought for Clara, for Elena, for his mother, for every soul that men like Cole and Thatcher had crushed under their heels. Cole's hands were around his throat, squeezing the life from him. The world was starting to fray at the edges, dark spots dancing in his vision. With his last ounce of strength, Silas fumbled for the hunting knife at his belt. He drove it upward, a desperate, clumsy thrust. He felt the blade sink home, felt Cole's body go rigid, a gasp of pained surprise escaping his lips. The hands around his throat loosened. Cole stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief, before he collapsed, his dead weight falling across Silas. Silas shoved the body off him and lay on the cold ground, gasping for air. The world was a spinning, blurry mess. He was bleeding from his arm, from his side, from a dozen smaller cuts and bruises. He had won, but the cost had been too high. He tried to push himself up, to call Clara's name, but his strength failed him. The darkness that had been nibbling at the edges of his vision rushed in and consumed him completely. Clara waited, her heart pounding. The silence after the final struggle more terrifying than the noise of the battle. She finally dared to peek around the boulder again. She saw Cole's body, and beside it, Silas, lying unnervingly still.
"Silas,"
she called out, her voice a trembling whisper. There was no answer. A wave of paralyzing fear washed over her, threatening to root her to the spot. But then a new feeling, a fierce, desperate strength born of the love she felt for the man lying broken on the ground, surged through her. He had not left her. She would not leave him. She ran to him, falling to her knees at his side. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his face as pale as the moon. She saw the new wound in his side, dark and slick with blood. He was dying. The last of Thatcher's men, the one with the wounded leg, was trying to crawl away. Clara didn't hesitate. She picked up Silas's fallen Colt, the weight of it heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. She pointed it at the man. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice shaking but hard as iron. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear. She had to get Silas to safety, to Matteo and Elena. It was their only chance. She looked at Silas, then at the horse. The task seemed impossible. He was a dead weight, and she was small, her own shoulder throbbing with a fiery pain. But the alternative was unthinkable. Sobbing with effort, she hooked her arms under his, dragging him, inch by painful inch, toward his horse. The animal shied away, its eyes rolling nervously at the smell of blood. She soothed it with a soft voice, her words a desperate prayer. She somehow, through sheer force of will, managed to heave him over the saddle, his limp body slumping over the horse's neck. She took the reins of both horses, mounted her own, and, without a backward glance, rode into the night. She was one small, determined figure against the vast, unforgiving darkness, a wounded man in her charge, riding toward the faint, distant promise of a safe harbor in the mountains. Time in the mountains moved differently. It was not measured by the town clock or the arrival of the stagecoach, but by the slow crawl of shadows across the valley floor, the changing color of the leaves on the aspen trees, and the gradual mending of a broken man. Weeks bled into a month, and a month bled into the next. Silas's recovery was a slow, arduous journey out of a deep, dark canyon of pain and guilt. The bullet wounds healed, leaving behind puckered, angry scars that mapped his brushes with death. But those were the easy wounds. The deeper ones, the ones in his soul, were slower to mend. In the long, quiet hours, his mind would betray him, replaying the moment he saw Clara dragged away, her scream echoing in the chambers of his memory. The guilt was a physical weight, a constant ache that was worse than any broken bone. He had promised her safety, and he had delivered her to a firefight and recapture. The fact that he had ultimately succeeded felt less like a victory and more like a debt he could never repay. Clara was his constant shadow, his silent keeper. She tended to his wounds with a gentle, practiced hand, changing his dressings, brewing the bitter herbal teas Elena prepared, and spooning thin broth into his mouth when he was too weak to feed himself. She rarely spoke. There was a fragile, glass-like quality to her, as if the smallest sound or sharpest word might shatter her. They existed in a world of shared silence, a space filled with the things they could not yet bring themselves to say. Her presence was a comfort, but it was also a constant, painful reminder of how close he had come to losing her, of how much she had suffered because of him. He would watch her from his cot, watch the way she moved about the small cabin, her steps light and careful. He saw the new lines of tension around her eyes, the way she would sometimes stare into the distance, her mind clearly revisiting the darkness of Thatcher's cellar. He saw that she was as wounded as he was, her scars just as deep, but invisible to the eye. The turning point came one night, long after Matteo and Elena had retired to their own small home nearby. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the chirping of crickets outside and the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Silas was awake, staring into the flames, wrestling with his demons. Clara sat in a chair near his cot, mending a tear in one of Matteo's shirts, her needle moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She finished her work, folded the shirt neatly, and set it aside. For a long time, she just sat there, her hands clasped in her lap. Then, she reached out and gently, tentatively, touched his hand where it lay on the rough wool blanket. Her touch was feather-light, a question. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, her gray eyes clear and deep in the firelight. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that had been held back for weeks. It was not an accusation. It was not a question. It was a statement of a miracle. In her world, men always left. They took what they wanted and they left. They made promises and they left. They died and they left. But he had not. He had come back from the dead, had walked into the heart of the lion's den, and had pulled her from the darkness. He had stayed. The two simple words broke the dam of his own guilt. "Clara," he started, his voice a hoarse rasp, wanting to apologize, to explain, to somehow atone for the pain he had caused her. She squeezed his hand, silencing him. "You stayed," she repeated, and this time there was a note of finality in her voice, of acceptance. It was an absolution. He had not failed. He had fulfilled the only promise that had ever mattered. From that night on, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer a silence of shared pain, but one of shared peace. They began to talk, not of the past, but of the present, of the taste of the fresh goat's milk, of the sharpness of the mountain air, of the name of a wildflower he spotted from the window. They were small, simple things, the building blocks of a new life, a new language. As his strength returned, he began to move around, first with a walking stick Matteo had carved for him, then on his own. He would sit on the small porch of the cabin, watching Clara work in Elena's garden. He saw the way she coaxed life from the soil, her hands gentle among the green shoots. He saw the tension slowly begin to leave her shoulders. He saw the return of a quiet light to her eyes. He began to help, his tasks small at first. He would chop vegetables for the evening meal. His one good arm surprisingly deft, he would help Matteo mend a fence. The simple, honest labor a balm to his restless spirit. Silas and Clara, Matteo and Elena. They formed a small, self-sufficient family, bound by a shared history of loss and a quiet, unspoken understanding. They built a life from the ground up, a life of hard work and simple rewards. The rhythm of the days was dictated by the sun and the seasons. They rose at dawn, worked the land, shared their meals, and in the evenings, sat by the fire, the comfort of their shared presence a shield against the darkness of the world below. But the past was not a ghost that could be banished so easily. It lived in Clara's reflexes, in the shadows that sometimes flickered in her eyes. The sharp crack of a falling branch would make her flinch, her body tensing as if expecting a blow. The sound of raised voices, even in jest, would send her retreating into herself. She would have nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, her throat raw from a scream that she had not allowed to escape. Silas learned to read the signs. When the shadows came for her, he would not press her with questions or offer empty reassurances. He would simply be there. He would sit with her in silence, his steady presence a solid, unmovable anchor in her turbulent sea of memory. Sometimes she would talk. She would speak of the cellar, of the cold, of the things she had endured. Her voice a flat, emotionless monotone, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. He would listen. He would not judge. He would not offer advice. He would simply listen. And in his listening, he gave her the one thing she needed most, a safe place to lay down her burdens. He understood that healing was not about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars. One morning, she came to him as he was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady beat in the crisp morning air. She was holding something in her hands. She was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes and made his heart ache with a fierce, protective love. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, delicate ring, woven from the blue and yellow wildflowers that grew in the high mountain meadows. "I have been owned my whole life," she said, her voice clear and strong. "By my father's poverty, by Thatcher's contracts, by the fear of what men would do to me. I do not want to be owned ever again." She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "But I want to choose." She held the ring out to him, a silent offering. It was not a plea. It was a declaration of her own free will. She was not a prize to be won or a damsel to be rescued. She was a woman, scarred and battered but whole, choosing her own path, choosing him. Silas put down the axe. He took the fragile ring from her hand, his calloused fingers gentle. He knew what this meant. It was a commitment far deeper than any words spoken before a preacher. He did not have a gold ring to offer her, no promise of an easy life. He had nothing but his own scarred hands and a heart that was irrevocably hers. He looked at her, at the brave, beautiful woman standing before him, and he felt a wave of humility. He did not propose marriage. The words felt wrong, too formal, too much like a contract. Instead, he spoke a different kind of vow, a promise that honored her past and secured their future. "I'll never leave," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Unless you tell me to." He slid the ring of wildflowers onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. News from the world below came a few weeks later, brought by a traveling tinker who had taken shelter with them for a night. Leland Thatcher was dead. There had been a raid on his estate, led by men from the Arizona Mining Company to whom he was in debt. In the chaos and the gunfire, Thatcher had been shot. No one knew by whom, and no one seemed to care. With him gone, his empire of fear and debt had crumbled overnight. His contracts were worthless, his men scattered to the winds. Sheriff Vance, the tinker said, had taken off his badge and left town the next day. Bramble Creek was free. The news settled over them not with a sense of triumph, but with a quiet, solemn relief. The monster was dead. The long shadow he had cast over their lives was finally gone. They returned to Bramble Creek a week later. The town felt different, the air lighter. The people on the street no longer walked with their heads down, their eyes averted. They met Silas and Clara's gaze with a quiet, knowing respect. No one spoke of what had happened, but they all knew. Martha Gable wept and hugged them both, pressing a basket of fresh bread and cheese into their hands. Jedediah, the old veteran, gave Silas a slow, single nod of approval from his perch on the blacksmith's porch. They were not heroes, but they were a part of the town's story now, a part of its liberation. They did not stay long. Bramble Creek was a part of their past, a place of ghosts and painful memories. Their future was in the mountains, in the quiet, simple life they had started to build. At the end of the story, they are sitting on the porch of a small, sturdy cabin that Silas built with his own 2 hands, with help from Mateo. It sits in a small meadow, surrounded by towering pines, with a view of the valley below. The sun is a fiery orange ball, sinking behind the distant peaks, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. A comfortable silence rests between them. Clara leans her head against his shoulder, her hand, still wearing a faded, dried ring of wildflowers, resting on his. He wraps his good arm around her, holding her close. The scars on his body are a testament to the battles he has fought. The peace in his heart is a testament to the one he has finally won. She turns her head, her breath warm against his neck, and her whisper is a soft echo of a promise made in a storm. "Don't leave after this." Silas smiles, a real, easy smile that reaches his eyes. He looks out at the setting sun, at the vast, peaceful wilderness that is now their home, and he feels a sense of belonging he has not felt since he was a boy, before the world had taught him about loss and fear. He pulls her a little closer, his answer a quiet, unshakable vow. "Not a chance." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.